Good afternoon. My name is Youtian Sheng. I'm the chair of Center for Chinese Studies and professor of geography here at Berkeley. I am pleased to welcome you all to this year's Elvera Kwang Siam Lim Memorial Lecture in Chinese Studies. Let me tell you a little bit about Elvera Kwang Siam Lim, the namesake of this lecture series. Mrs. Lim was born in Shantou, Guangdong Province in 1928, and she migrated to Hong Kong later on, got her PhD from University of Hawaii, and started teaching in biology department of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. After her retirement, here is the connection. She moved to Oakland, California, where she passed away on March 27, 2006. This endowed lecture series was made possible through a generous gift to the Center for Chinese Studies by Mrs. Lim's family to honor her dedication to scholarly exchange. With this endowment, we bring one eminent scholar to Berkeley each year to present a public lecture, meet with our faculty and graduate students, and generally foster scholarly exchange among colleagues. In addition to this lecture series, Mrs. Lim's family also established an endowed graduate student fellowship competition in her name to reward academic excellence in Chinese studies. Today's lecture, if I am allowed to do a little bit of propaganda, is also a part of the Global China lecture series that the Center for Chinese Studies is putting together this year. We think with all these debates in recent years around China's rise in the global stage, it will be helpful for us to think more deeply and broadly about what China's globality really means, and for us to reflect on the implications of this debate from different perspectives across disciplines. With that, I would like to introduce today's speaker for Elvera Kwang Siam Lim Memorial Lecture and the Global China Talk Series, Professor Wendy Larson of East Asian Languages and Literatures, and Vice Provost for Poland Programs at University of Oregon. Professor Larson is a proud product of Berkeley. She received her PhD from Department of Oriental Languages at Berkeley, now the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. She's one of the leading scholars in film studies and literature studies, and she is extremely productive. In addition to her numerous journal articles, edited volumes, and book chapters and translation works of various lengths from Chinese to English, she has published several very important monographs, including From Aqiu to Lei Feng, Freud and Revolutionary Spirit in 20th Century China, published in 2006. Women and Writing in Modern China, published in 1998. And Literary Authority in the Chinese Writer, Ambivalence and Autobiography, published in 1991. Her current research project, which is what she will be talking about today, takes a critical view on performing Chinese national culture on the global stage. I would let her tell us what this is all about. Without further ado, let us welcome Professor Wendy Larson.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here at UC Berkeley, because I haven't been here for a long time, but I do remember spending quite a lot of time here in the Oriental Languages department and in the library, which I understand is now spread all over the place. So it's really great to be here, and thank you for taking a very beautiful afternoon to come and listen to me. So I know that many of you know Zhang Yimou. He is a very much admired director and also a very much hated director in China. And since he began his work in the 1980s, the late 1980s, as a director, he has seemed to provoke many, many arguments and discussions and debate. And there's now several PhD dissertations on Zhang Yimou in China and master's theses as well. And there's a continuing profusion of articles that come out about him, over twice as many as for any other single director. So I first started getting interested in him quite a long time ago, but I really got interested when I saw Hero, and this is one of his most controversial films. I disagreed with the interpretation that was very common at the time, that Hero was supporting authoritarian power. And I found instead that the film did a very good job in testing the cultural demand of the nation-state political form and its relevance to globalization. So that is to say that it tested the demand that each nation have its own cultural foundation and some degree of authenticity, which is a highly ambivalent and contested, but also very important term. Now, although auteur studies have been criticized in film, that is, studies that focus on one director, as giving too much credit to a director in what is ultimately a collaborative enterprise, as implying authorial intent, and is based on a romantic notion of individual genius, I nonetheless decided to limit this study that I'm doing on to Zhang Yimou and to a subset of his films, not all of his films. I chose the films that I felt revolved around the particular kind of work that culture can and cannot do in our present time period. So when I say culture, I do not really mean only specific ways of thinking or identifiable cultural forms, such as certain kinds of literature, architecture, art, cuisine, ways of dressing, etc. I also don't mean simply the dense content of daily life as it is expressed in relationships, a locally developed sense of time and place, or culturally based habits and traditions. Rather, I'm interested in films that may look at those things, but that also query both the conditions and the implications of China's position as it moves into the future. So there's a temporal aspect to the cultural investigation that I'm doing. And importantly, it's important to state that I'm not interested in this project in Chineseness or in studying what specifically is Chinese about a particular form of culture. I also don't think Zhang Yimou is interested in that. One strand of the what culture can do trajectory exists in films that tap the socialist legacy for future possibilities. Today I'll discuss two films that work along these lines. Red Sorghum, which was Zhang's first film in his work as a director and came out in 1987. Happy Times will be my main focus, and it came out over 10 years later. So here you see the list of Zhang Yimou's work. He has the final film just came out a few months ago, and I haven't yet seen it. But whenever I see some new work coming out by him, I just think, oh, it's more work for me. But I guess I will see it eventually. Both of these films foreground the socialist past and the principles that were associated with it: the importance and value of communal life, the rejection of self-benefit in favor of self-sacrifice, the passion of collectivity, and the transcendental as well as the pragmatic value of hard work. In Red Sorghum, however, we see the socialist legacy valorized, whereas in Happy Times, it is viewed critically. Well, there's three parts to this. The first part will be on Red Sorghum, glorious work and vigorous song, taking what is yours. And the second part is they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work, Happy Times and the residue of socialism. Probably some of you have heard that phrase before, an old joke in the Soviet Union. And then the third part is on socialism and the gays. So this is the first part on Red Sorghum. Red Sorghum begins with the words of the narrator, grandson of Joar and my grandpa, and no visuals. The narrator speaks through a voiceover throughout. The tale of his grandma and grandpa, which is the main story of the plot, is an old one that some believe and others do not, the male voice states. These questions about historical veracity, along with the several moments of a totally black screen that withholds all visual clues, produces a blank space of open implication and gives us permission and even encourages us to regard what follows as a fantasy, or at least as not entirely true. And indeed, the film displays an almost unreal unification of work and play that elevates daily life into a transcendent experience molded by vigor and equality. This romanticized condition leads to a heightened life of the senses, embodying the physical power of culture, especially in song. The crude songs are an easily identified form of culture that is performed within a conceptually enclosed, insider-only space. Their unproblematic directness eliminates the standpoint of a diegetic viewer, who appears in the form of someone watching with much greater regularity in Zhang's films that foreground culture as performance. And finally, the relationship of this culture to what is outside suggests the symbolic insertion of the idealized community into the global environment. In this case, the outside is indicated by two elements: bandit Sanpao, and the Japanese invaders. While Sanpao is a threat under certain circumstances that must be challenged, he nonetheless is part of the community and their environment, and he is absorbed back into the collective when the true outsiders arrive. So via these three forms, collective labor, song, and the outsider, Red Sorghum optimistically structures a deep connection between the people and the land. I often call it Zhang Yimou's only optimistic film, which most people look at me like, what are you talking about? It's so depressing. Work exists as a sharp materiality which emerges through sweat, dirt, exhaustion, steam, heat, and sound. After Joar, that's the young woman there, begins to work in the winery, we never see her in clean, colorful clothes again. She and the others are always sweaty, their garments stained and dirtied. The film presents this daily life culture rooted in labor as both down to earth and somewhat mystical. In identifying and analyzing what he views as the fascist elements of Red Sorghum that come into full flower in Hero, the critic Wang Yichuan argues that while it is possible to view My Grandpa's forceful takeover of the winery and of Joar as a class and gender struggle, what belies this interpretation is the fact that rather than overturn this structure, My Grandpa simply repeats what went before, putting him in the position of owner of the winery and the woman. Wang Yichuan is one of the most fervent anti-Zhang Yimou critics in China. He's a professor at Beijing Shifan Daxue, and he has published many, many articles. Via the narrator, who is approximately the same generation as the audience, the film constructs a road into a mythical tale that encourages viewers to understand that without the forcible, unreasonable, and uncivilized taking of power, China will go nowhere. That's his argument. One argument against Wang's interpretation is that he does not recognize the way in which labor is reconfigured through Joar's assumption of control. Her willingness to put herself on the line, her generosity, vigor, and kindness are the opposite of her husband, who has leprosy, Li Dato's contagious illness, and disregard for his young wife, whom he purchases by bartering with her father. Joar's gregarious engagement is a powerful contrast to his invisibility and silence. This valorization of community and self-sacrifice, ideals that emerge from the socialist legacy, is an expression of strength that can transcend temporal boundaries. Through the songs, the film further develops the much-noted primitive Northwest vision and angers those looking for a more elegant expression of Chinese culture. Critics have praised and scolded the wild abandon and stark physicality of the 10-minute sedan jolting scene and its crudely shouted song, as well as its coarse eroticism. The role that the songs play can be better revealed if we compare them with those of Chen Kaige-'s 1984 film Yellow Earth, in which lyrics and melodies are important plot elements. Set in 1939, Communist Party official Gu Qing is sent to collect the hauntingly beautiful song sung by peasants in the central China province of Shanxi. His larger mission is to pair new revolutionary lyrics to the old tunes, with the goal of inspiring the troops to fight the Japanese. The story centers on Cui Qiao and her upcoming marriage to a much older man. Generally, the songs refer to a miserable life in which lack of control and agency is the norm. Cui Chao Father sings directly about the cruel traditions such as the arranged marriage of young girls, which is her situation exactly. Overall, the songs are tightly connected to the actual life and experience of the people, and they embody and project the true condition of the harsh, demanding land. Yet, it turns out that the party's cultural worker, Gu Qing, has made a crucial mistake. He is sent only to collect tunes, not to teach the people new lyrics, and transgresses that boundary when he teaches a song to Cui Chao's young brother, Han Han. Here. Listening nearby, Cui Chao hears the revolutionary words as a melodious arrow to the heart, giving birth to the idea that she may be able to escape her fate. She dies trying to cross the river on her way to Yan'an. The songs in Yellow Earth are profound expressions of the affective life of the people who are trapped in time and space. That link, at once both strong and fragile, presents the songs as culture at its most brutally authentic. Tasked by the Communist Party with a mission that is instrumental at heart, Gu Qing senses but ultimately cannot interpret the potent connection to a hard-won existence and its emotional life that the songs both contain and convey. He has taken culture entirely too lightly, pushing aside its complex web of effective and performative power. Like the song sung by Cui Chao, her father, and Han Han, the songs in Red Sorghum appear to come directly from the lives of the people. Yet although these songs are also about being trapped in marriage, they have none of the deterministic resignation of the songs in Yellow Earth, but rather enable or express strength and vigor. The most well-known and widely mimicked song, Little Sister, Go Boldly Forward. I strongly recommend that you search for it on YouTube, and you will see all of the renditions that it had. So many singers have sung this, really wonderful. This song speaks to a powerful forward impetus. The film shuns realism in presenting culture as emerging from and enabling the active, positive, life-giving spirit of the people, rather than expressing the truth of their existence. As a pure expression of this power, the songs are part of the film's understanding that culture can accomplish positive work. Even though Red Sorghum is set well before the socialist period, it is structured through unquestioned authenticity of those times. Here, the Chinese socialist experience becomes a treasure trove of possibilities that are abstracted and considered for their foundational raw material. In the decade between Red Sorghum and Happy Times, the positive living legacy of the socialist past, pressured by the capitalist transformation, lost its productive aura and turned into a residue. And now I want to take a look at the film Happy Times, which came 13 years after Red Sorghum. Happy Times features a middle-aged, laid-off factory worker with little to offer in the way of matchmaking, and a subtext of a human emotional economy inextricably entwined with market values. As with its immediate predecessor, Keep Cool, that's 有话好好说, which translates as keep cool, I don't know how. Happy Time revolves around the demand for payment for goods for an anticipated service made towards someone unable or unwilling to pay. In Keep Cool, the sum is to cover reimbursement for a destroyed laptop, and in Happy Times, it is the cost of marriage for Lao Zhao, who has found a willing partner but lacks the 50 grand for the wedding that she demands. In both cases, the market transaction is overtaken by what may have seemed to be a tangent in the plot, and a new tale of emotional connection takes center stage, bubbling up as a kind of narrative hope that something other than the apparently linear, unchangeable story of exchange value will prevail. In Happy Times, the main character is motivated not only by social ideas of language, community, and morality. This socialist residue, with its implications of an authentic historical legacy, does not exist to nearly the same degree in the Moyen story on which the film is based. Both Red Sorghum and Happy Times are based on Moyen fiction. Although the married Ding Shifu, the protagonist in the text, is initially slightly embarrassed by the sexual implications of the happiness hut, he quickly adapts and even joins in. Not only is he titillated as he listens to the sounds of couples making love, but he also finds new sexual vigor himself. As opposed to Lao Zhao, his sole concern is not moral culpability, but rather that the police will find out about his illicit business. So the happiness hut is the small kind of bus that they find sitting out somewhere, and they turn it into a fake massage parlor so that the blind girl in the story can pretend like she actually has a job. In the Moyen story, this becomes a kind of, it then changes into a place where basically they paint it. You saw the original picture with the red on it, and they allow young people to come in and use the room. In the story, it's very clear they use it to make love. In the film, Lao Zhao does not allow that to happen. In fact, the marriage proposal, the blind girl, and the fake massage parlor in the factory do not exist in the literary text. The film has created a new layer of socialist ways of being in the world that both gesture toward a once embodied life world and, at the same time, bring together various performed illusions. On the one hand, we see the character of Lao Zhao. We see in the character of Lao Zhao the idealism that motivated belief in a positive future through self-sacrifice and communal life. On the other, the artifice that sprang up to sustain that vision when the material world did not follow through also is a prominent aspect of his personality. And part of the illusion is the fantasy that help will come from the outside, miraculously solving the fissure between idealism and its actualization in a working social system. Lao Zhao, that is the film character, as opposed to Master Ding, the story character, does not allow the young visitors to the happiness hut to close the door. Attributing his moral indignation at accepting money to provide a room where young people can have sex to an imaginary organization with rules emanating from above, Lao Zhao favors mouse speak. In this case, this is regulated by the authorities. 这是上边规定的. Other phrases such as to solve difficulties, 克服困难, and comrade, 同志, as well as references to the party as a moral authority, often pop up in his conversation. Now, Lao Zhao does not always speak this old-fashioned socialist language. Rather, it comes out at the point when he wants to bolster a false veneer. For example, he cuts the cheap carnations to make them look like roses so that he can give a more expensive flower to his fiancée. And then when he does give them as he presents the roses, the fake roses to his fiancée, he invokes what party members do when they're visiting the sick on television, in a television show. Now, this reference to a screen-mediated presentation as a model points to the alienation of these social practices and hints at the director's emphasis on the mediation of the screen and other technologies, as we see in Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles, another film from 2005. In these continual references and white lies, a pattern emerges, implying that Lao Zhao is burdened by a troublesome legacy. We can readily see that much as socialist culture at its worst made a show of pretense with jacked-up quotas and hyped success stories, he also is heavily invested in surface manipulation. Anything that cannot be explained or rationalized is molded and transformed through socialist rhetoric. And yet, although Lao Zhao's optimism may be based on a socialist legacy of shining, if thin, facades, he comes across as a fundamentally good person. The film's approach to the socialism that formed the life world of the past is mixed, and this still exists in Lao Zhao's personality and interactions. It recognizes honest intent, intellectual respect, and emotional affiliation, while suggesting that socialism was tainted by profound deceptions of all kinds. The in-between position of Lao Zhao, and to a lesser degree his friends, speaks to this split, which manifests itself mostly in the main character. We see, for example, that Xiaofu, his friend, has less residue than does Lao Zhao. He lives in a well-outfitted apartment and initially tries, somewhat half-heartedly, to escape the attentions of his former colleague. Of course, as a link to the socialist past, Lao Zhao can elicit from him a reluctant, comradely kind of emotion. But Xiaofu also plays another role when he rejects his former comrade's requests for money, instead turning him toward entrepreneurship. Overall, the enhancement of socialist mores in the film, as compared with the Moyen tale, works in two directions. On one hand, Lao Zhao's moral perspective prevents him from making the money he needs, and on the other, he is full of well-meaning subterfuge. In addition to problems with Maoist terminology, there are other troubling concerns. Despite his basic kindness, Lao Zhao is far from selfless. He initially shows little sympathy for the blind girl and even tells his fiancée that were it up to him, he would boot the girl out. His attempt to kiss his fiancée while her son lies asleep in her lap exposes his selfish motivation, as well as those of the fiancée. She claims inconvenience, a malleable term in this case implying the inability of the couple to become intimate without a private place. Thus, the eviction of Xiaowu becomes a necessary condition for the marriage to reach consummation. And by withholding her sexual availability, she transfers this responsibility onto Lao Zhao. The 17 previous marriage attempts, the demand for an expensive wedding, and Lao Zhao's subsequent lies about his income all indicate that he cannot satisfy his desire without moving farther into the capitalist realm. The lingering significance of sexual desire, which is much more pronounced in Zhang Yimou's earliest films, as a motivator becomes more apparent when we compare Zhang's Red trilogy, Red Sorghum, Judo, and Raise High the Red Lantern, to Happy Times. These three early films zero in on one brutish and abusive male, one vulnerable, abused, beautiful, and spirited woman, and one savior male, to whom the abused woman appeals, generally in a sexual way. By contrast, in Happy Times, the female role has been split into two, and Lao Zhao's sexual desire is assigned to his fiancée alone. Although Xiaowu is only a year younger than, for example, Song Lian in Raise the Red Lantern, she appears childlike and devoid of sexualized elements. For Jiu'er, Judo, and Song Lian, these are the three heroines of the early movies, the manipulations of sexual desire is a tool they can use to attract males who will rescue them. From the position of these males, although doing the right thing may be dangerous, it leads to substantial benefits. Happy Times revises the one male, two female structure and reorganizes gender relations, eventually separating self-benefit in the guise of sexual fulfillment from ethics or doing the right thing. And I think that the reason Zhang Yimou does this is so he can in a more pointed manner, query the socialist legacy of self-sacrifice. The vulnerable young women, the sexual relations, and the issues of sight and gaze drew my attention to Zhang Yimou's second film, Judo. The film's most famous scene shows Judo bearing her bruised body to Tianqing, who is salaciously peeping at her through a hidden hole in the wall. Although Tianqing watches out of sexual desire, Judo alters the equation when she forces him to view her not as an erotic object, but as battered flesh. She knows that Tianqing is watching, but he does not know that she knows until she exposes her chest, looks back, and begins to sob. While Tianqing gazes on her out of lust or self-benefit, she forces an ethical confrontation. There's a similar scene in Happy Times. Like Judo and Tianqing, Lao Zhao and a near-naked Xiaowu also look directly at each other, but with different implications. As Lao Zhao tries to accommodate his fiancée, who has demanded that he get the girl out of her apartment, he runs out of options and relinquishes his own small place to Xiaowu. However, he forgets his bedding and he has to stealthily return to retrieve it. This brings him face to face with the blind girl, who is unaware of his presence. She cannot return the gaze to force an ethical challenge, as did Judo with Tianqing. Yet despite her inability to look back, Xiaowu's round, flat face and blindness allow her to aggressively take control of the cinematic space as she moves through the room. Let's look at the clip. It's interesting at the beginning because he's trying to explain why his house is so poor and impoverished, and she says, "Where's the refrigerator?" And he says, "Well, this is the workers' house. It's not really mine. I live with foreigners in a mansion." And she says, "But weren't you taking me to your house?" And he says, my house and the workers' house is all together," or something like. We all share. I mean, it's another kind of socialist rhetoric thing. Lao Zhao's seemingly innocent quandary teases out a visual see or be seen logic of the socialist legacy that relates to the performance of socialist values. After all, this gaze, if we can call it that, we can't really quite call it that, but if we can call it that, targets Lao Zhao's fear of being seen, as in all of the ruses that he perpetrates. At the same time, however, the scene shows how the simple fact of Xiao Wu's existence erodes his desire and ability to maximize self-benefit, with the level human-height camera position equalizing the two bodies as Xiao Wu pushes him backwards. Now, with the destruction of the Happiness Hut, Lao Zhao moves on to a new idea, enticing his fellow workers to construct a fake massage parlor so that Xiao Wu can believe she has a job. The once gainfully employed workers quite literally build the bogus business with the cast-offs of the old socialist world. That is, they go into the old factory and they actually take the pieces and parts and build a fake massage parlor in the old factory. Itself once built on the repeating myth of wildly successful production that would overtake England, America, and other advanced societies. Much as the construction of positive appearances designed to transfer the utopian future into the present drove the socialist society, Lao Zhao's friend Xiao Fu early on realizes that all they need to do is to pretend that they have a job for Xiao Wu. The building of a pretense, a veneer, a surface, or sensory facade is the gist of their machinations. Whatever you tell her, that's the way it is, Xiao Fu proclaims. In this new endeavor, Xiao Wu's blindness appears to be a great advantage for the schemers. Although the laid-off workers go to great lengths to make sure that the sensory input of the fake massage parlor is accurate, visiting a real massage parlor to see exactly what it feels and sounds like, finding fabric to cover the metal walls, and recording street sounds to play in the old factory, they quickly run out of money to pay Xiao Wu and resort to cut-up pieces of paper of the same size. Yet their attempts to build a sensual authenticity waver when Xiao Wu runs her fingers across the money, feels its edges, and brings it to her nose to smell it. The blind girl's uncanny ability to tell the difference between real and fake money produces an important moment. It is money, the harsh symbol and mechanism of capitalist exchange, that brings the unsustainable socialist camaraderie and community in the film screeching to a halt. The goal of the former workers is to continue the deception until some other means of handling Xiao Wu can be found. This emphasis on delay echoes the temporal hiatus built into the socialist economy, which was based on an unsubstantiated utopian imaginary that figuratively transported the wealth of future production into an effective present. I just put that in there. Through the combination of her blindness and her ability to discern the truth via her other senses, Xiao Wu escapes the grip of the wide-ranging deception in which the do-gooders deploy every possible physical, emotional, and intellectual strategy. It is only Xiao Wu's ability to perceive the truth that allows her to break through this feat of comprehensive environmental engineering. Considering the workers' careful construction of reality and the intricate fabric of props they arrange, we could connect the Maoist idea of correct knowledge, 正确思想, to the overall situation. Proposed in a talk by Mao Zedong in 1963, the demand for correct knowledge reached an extreme during the Cultural Revolution, eventually spanning a meaning that ranged from thorough acceptance of and identification with certain ideals to playing along. When Xiao Wu figures it all out, we see a faraway shot of the girl standing in the front of a rusty, rundown factory with weeds growing outside. This is the reality that Lao Zhao and his comrades are trying to hide. The desire for a cure, in this case the girl's blindness, is a central theme through which the film brings in a non-local outside measure of progress. The externality of modern medicine and the implied necessity of economic growth that underlies it forces a comparative context that Xiao Wu, Lao Zhao, and Xiao Fu all recognize, foregrounding the global pressure that the new economic regime puts on the old. Xiaowu is the most vulnerable of characters, but her desire and ability to discern inner, outer, false, and true makes her our guide as we slowly comprehend that Happy Times is a devastating allegory of socialism that investigates the reasons why it is not possible at the present moment of global capitalist expansion to locate the hope for the future within its ethical and experiential framework. The ease with which Zhang Yimou incorporated the values of socialism, cooperation, communal ways of life, self-sacrifice, into Red Sorghum has become the self-conscious, awkward, tenderly deceptive posturing of Lao Zhao as he tries to find a place for himself in the shifting world. So now we'll go on to socialism and the gaze. Fifth and some sixth-generation directors have problematized the issue of who is looking, who is being looked at, and what the implications of the gaze or gazed-atness are. Often a performance or a play within a play takes place under the conditions of duress, which adds an element of coercion. In his Farewell My Concubine, Chen Kai-ge stages Chinese opera before various hostile audiences, including Japanese troops. In The World, directed by Zhang Mo, migrant workers imagining freedom and mobility come to Beijing to perform in a theme park called The World that delimits rather than engages and opens the globe to them. Zhang Yimou's films often address performance under coercion, zeroing in on the implications of being a performer or a viewer. The characters in To Live exist under an oppressive internalized sense of being watched, with the play of puppets as a metaphor for their condition. Shanghai Triad brings both stage performance and the peeping of a watching servant boy into play. Keep Cool features actor Jiang Wen hiring others to perform his love for his beloved. In this case, he has recruited Zhang Yimou to perform as a peasant, singing out his love. Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles centers on mediated performance, and Flowers of War revolves around the coerced stage performance. Below, I will briefly consider the ramifications of the gaze in Happy Times, and through it evaluate the film's treatment of socialism as a residue rather than as a legacy. In a 1975 article that has become a film theory classic and also been, attacked and deconstructed multiple times, Laura Mulvey describes the male gaze as a point of view that confers power and mastery. The male gaze is structured by active looking and passive being looked at and is heavily gendered, with implications of pleasure in looking and pleasure in being looked at. Mulvey describes the three looks specific to film: the camera, the audience, and the characters that produce a sense of reality. In this gendered, eroticized structure, the male role assumes a greater-than-life agency, becoming the active one of forwarding the story and making things work, while women become the essence of to-be-looked-atness. Another gaze theorist, Todd McGowan, argues that the capitalist gaze naturalizes choice by implicitly linking it to human nature. This visual connection provides a rationale for the failure of communism and for the success of capitalism, which supposedly emerged from the essence of human biological nature, or self-interest and its corollary, competition. The political decisions that actually have produced the capitalist system then vanish, leaving a sense that things are simply the way they are. Within an economic system that normalizes into the way of the world or the background of pure animality, sight and vision play an important role, boosting the illusion of naturalness, according to McGowan. Our investment as spectators skews the visual field, but we are oblivious, generally perceiving it as naturally the way things are rather than as the result of our decisions. Another angle on gaze theory comes from post-colonial criticism, which begins from the observation that colonized bodies were indeed filmed as entomological or zoological specimens. According to Paula Ahmad, the right to look without being looked at, as well as the disciplinary power that comes from looking, is counteracted by the return gaze or the evidence of the camera being acknowledged by the subjects filmed. Ahmad develops the term visual riposte to designate not just the return gaze, but the intent within the subject to challenge the camera's dominance. These three gazes, the male gaze, the capitalist gaze, and visual repost as a demanding return gaze, can give us some clues about how we may want to interpret, especially happy times. While Zhang's first film, Red Sorghum, is an optimistic vision that recoups socialist values as fundamental to the future of the people, Happy Time brutally reveals the same values to be essentially deceptive. The latter film, straddles the two economic and cultural regimes, a transitional position that, despite showing a clear temporal direction, disallows the audience complete or comfortable identification with either. The main gaze, or the perspective of Lao Zhao that could be assumed by the viewing audience, is made schizophrenic through its allegiance to these two regimes. The latter sphere, wherein lies the future, contains Lao Zhao's dreams of companionship, sexual pleasure, and the wealth necessary for their realization. Here also lies the imagined cure to Xiaowu's blindness, which is located either in Beijing, a site standing in for a more advanced China, or in an America imagined as hyper-advanced. How am I doing for time? Okay, all right, okay. On the negative side, excessive focus on self-benefit and the pursuit of style, or the modern look that Lao Zhao's fiancée has captured in her redecorated apartment, as well as its emotional power, belong to this realm. So I made these two things. So here's the old socialist style. Messy, drab, uninviting. You see the chaos, things lying around, these old-style embroidered covers and pillows, frumpy, mismatched furniture, cords, the old CRT television. Anyone who studied in China when I did back in the late 70s, early 80s will recognize this. And then she is saying, look at you, you're a disgrace. She's talking to the blind girl. Here's the capitalist style after she remodels her apartment with a nice house plant, modern art, colorful leather furniture, a Persian carpet, and a new large screen television. So it's very, very clear. Even though you don't see but flashes of these things, it's still very, very clear. And so after she gets this new modern apartment all set up, she talks to Lao Zhao outside in the hall. And as she says to him, it's got a great vibe, you'll feel it. She wiggles at this point, kind of to imply sexual rewards that will come to him in the new great vibe place. Now we also find disregard in this area for the suffering of others to the point of wishing they were dead, as voiced by his fiancée's son. The obesity of the fiancée and her son, highlighted throughout, points to consumerist stuffing under the capitalist regime. Countering is the socialist location of value within the community, a perspective rooted in a vision of caring and helping others, in common moral standards, and in a collective history that has produced effective bonds and a shared worldview that is not based on consumerist accumulation. Yet on this side, we also see the central pretense of work when no work is actually to be done. This is the key deception that's carried from the receding world of socialist relationships into the new arena, where the laid-off do-gooders build, participate in, and gaze on the pretend job that Xiaowu undertakes. It is no accident that work or labor under Maoism was heavily romanticized, nor that it has been thoroughly deconstructed by writers and filmmakers in the post-Mao era. The male gaze in its erotic dimension, or Lao Zhao's active search for a marriage partner, charts the road into the sphere of money-making. And this is one way in which the capitalist gaze is relevant to happy times. Lao Zhao's search for marital happiness naturalizes the overarching value of making money and the visual pleasure associated with this normalization. In the initial scene of the film, the visual glory of capitalism comes to the viewer in the cafe, made delightful, enticing, modern, and all-encompassing by the natural plants framing the image, the ornate furniture, the Tiffany lamps, the cars and high-rises in the background, the gorgeous red outfit of the fiancé, and the smiling, coy interaction between the two lovers. Happy Times addresses the question of whether it is possible to recoup the values of the socialist past and on that basis to move into a sustainable future, or in any way create an alternative to the massive transformation that capitalism has wrought. It is here that the third gaze, the challenging return gaze, or the visual repost, and Zhang Yimou's tendency to embed within his films the staging of performance can reveal yet another degree of meaning. The play within a play in Happy Times consists of the entire deception of Xiao Wu, and in particular, her fake employment in the massage parlor. She is the unwitting performer, and the workers who participate are the viewers. This performance, which consists of the performer unknowingly playing a part in a prearranged play, parallels the relationship of the performer in the colonial films described by Paula Ahmed. Just as recording the colonized evokes heartening warmth in the minds of the colonizers, Xiao Wu's so-called work provides a comforting spectacle to those whose factory could not make the transition from socialism into capitalism. The former factory workers happily find their self-value confirmed in Xiao Wu's performance, and they struggle to keep the relationship of knowledgeable spectator to innocent performer alive. Maybe this relationship could be theorized as the socialist gaze. However, is there a return gaze or any form of visual repost? The answer to that question draws us to the moment when Xiao Wu realizes that she is not really working. Her choices upon this realization shift the grounds of the gaze to the nature of performance itself. She gets a lot of clues. They record sounds out on the street and then put them on a recorder, but the recorder suddenly comes to an end. It's a tape. She knows that the money is fake, and there's other clues that she uses a pole to try to find the ceiling of the massage parlor, and she can't find one. So she knows something's wrong. Although Xiao Wu's new awareness lays bare her manipulator's intent and her role in the performance, she vacillates. Her decision to continue working, at least for a while, snatches agency from the laid-off workers and their leader, Lao Zhao, and places it squarely in her hands. Even though she knows that she's not working for wages, Xiao Wu prioritizes the goodwill that Lao Zhao and the others are extending to her through their efforts. Although she cannot direct a return gaze at those watching her, she concocts the continuation of her performance for their benefit, essentially establishing the conditions for them to watch. Happy Times features two endings, one for the international audience and another for the domestic audience. In the first case, Xiao Wu eventually cannot continue her role in the ruse and leaves to find her father, while Lao Zhao is hit by a truck and ends at the brink of death. In the second case, the abandoned factory is demolished, leaving Lao Zhao and Xiao Wu standing together with the massage table before them. Both versions feature the reading of a letter written by Lao Zhao to Xiao Wu in the voice of her father who abandoned her, with a promise of all the fatherly comfort and support that she needs. As David Lee states, both endings pronounce the apparent death of utopia and an end of happy times. However, since Xiao Wu strikes out on her own in the international version, Lee locates a conflicted affirmation of self-sufficiency, independence, and the efficiency of the market. By contrast, the domestic version clearly illustrates the destruction wrought by capitalism, but left standing is the bond and relationship between Xiao Wu and Lao Zhao. This ending, highlighted against immense social devastation and transformation, establishes them as historical subjects, according to Lee. He notes that in this Chinese ending, so it really is a domestic Chinese ending, Happy Times shows us that although the border transcending capital has indeed played havoc with traditional psychic habits, but that the cultural as a mode of non-commodified difference and social practice is not entirely drained of its resistance. So in other words, what he thinks happened is that either the studio or Zhang Yimou changed the ending for the international audience to make it more capitalist, sort of, more independent striving. Although it may be going too far to call the bleak ending resistance, the domestic version does point to a continuing, if difficult, relationship between Lao Zhao and Xiao Wu as the residue of a once embodied, vital socialist experiment. At the same time, in both versions, the fake letter reaffirms the hypocrisy of a loving father striving from afar to make enough money to find a cure for Xiao Wu's blindness, which is the last gasp of a well-meant deceit. If we regard the future for Lao Zhao and Xiao Wu as the symbolic prospect of a non-commodified lifestyle, or as the progressive heritage of socialism, what remains as a positive legacy? Happy Times somewhat tenderly places socialist culture into the present moment, considering whether it can provide satisfaction in the present, function as one kind of authentic heritage from the past, and contain hope for the continuation of a vital life into the future. As compared to the narrow presentist scope that Zhang successfully enacts in Happy Times, predecessor Keep Cool, we see a greater temporal range that includes clear reference to the socialist past, as well as the beckoning capitalist cornucopia of the contemporary world and an expansive spatial environment populated by the rusty abandoned factory shells dotting the land. It is this effective spatial and imaginary landscape through which Happy Times adapts Mo Yan's story, piece by piece deconstructing the romance of socialism under contemporary political conditions. Thank you.
For the wonderful story. We will have a respondent to Wendy's talk today. It's a pleasure to introduce to you Professor Pen Chi from the Rhetoric Department at Berkeley. Pen is also the chair of Center for Southeast Asian Studies here at Berkeley. He's another super productive author, writer, scholar, in addition to journal articles and several edited volumes. And he's also the author of 3 very important monographs, including Inhuman Conditions on Cosmopolitanism and Human Rights, published in 2007, and Spectral Nationality, Passages of Freedom from Kant to Post-Colonial Literatures of Liberation, published in 2003. And also earlier, Cosmopolitics, Thinking and Feeling Beyond the Nations, published in 1998. Since Pen never sleeps, he's currently completing another 3 books on vastly different subjects. One of them is directly related to today's talk about globalization and world cinema from the 3 Chinas that focuses on the films of Jia Zhang Wendy also mentioned in her talk just now from mainland China, and Cai Mingliang, another very important director from Taiwan, and Fu Chen or Chen Guo, a director from Hong Kong. So, Pen Chi.
Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to serve as a discussion to my dear friend Wendy Larson's lecture on Zhang Yimou and the Socialist Legacy, not least because we were both fellows at the Asia Research Institute in Singapore in the 2012 to 2013 academic year when she was working on the project. We had many stimulating conversations then, and it is, of course, very good to be able to follow a project to its conclusion. Professor Larson is, of course, more of an expert on Zhang Yimou than I am, so what I want to do in this response is to briefly summarize what I take to be the most salient points of her lecture by positioning it in theoretical terms and then raising 3 questions to try to stimulate a broader discussion. I hope that some of our colleagues and students from film studies and EALC will engage with the finer points about Professor Larson's interpretation of the 2 films in question, Red Sorghum and Happy Times, especially her interesting use of theories of the gaze. Now, Professor Larson's lecture raises an important ethico-political and existential question of our times. What is it that remains for left cultural politics in an age of capitalist globalization? where the last preserve of socialist culture is threatened with erosion and even extinction as the result of the PRC's active and rapid integration into the neoliberal regime of the capitalist world system. Posing this question through a study of Zhang Yimou's films is provocative because it challenges the popular view of Zhang Yimou as an ideologue for the official nationalist culture of the PRC state. In a provocative reading that contrasts Zhang's directorial debut in 1987, Red Sorghum, to his 2000 film Happy Times, she argues that what interests him the most is not an archaic, essentialized, and museumized Chinese culture, but instead a culture that arises from the Chinese historical experience of socialism. This culture has important ethical values such as communal solidarity, self-sacrifice, collective passion, and a respect for the edifying character of labor. These ethical values are all summed up under the principle of authenticity, a rich concept with a heavy philosophical baggage that I will return to later. This makes it an important resource for the reconstellation of ethical life for the masses of mainland China as the PRC state aligns itself with and enters into capitalist globalization and positions itself as a triumphant and dominant actor within the global capitalist interstate system. Now, the culture at stake here, this socialist culture of the title is Socialist Legacy, this culture at stake is a non-hegemonic culture in two senses. First, it is an abandoned, neglected, or marginalized strand of socialist culture that challenges the official national culture, legitimizing the authoritarian power of the PRC state, which is socialist in name, but capitalist in its practices. We can half in jest call this a subaltern socialist culture. Second, this subaltern socialist culture is obviously distinguished from global capitalist culture, characterized by consumerism and the individualistic pursuit of economic profit and particularistic interests. However, in happy times, this subaltern socialist culture is now untenable. Its authenticity is increasingly under question and indeed severely ironized, as typified, for example, by the bourgeoisification of Lao Tzu's consciousness, the alienation he undergoes at the level of subjectivity that splits him into a public image where he adheres to communal values and a private self where he pursues selfish erotic desires and seeks to move into a capitalist way of life to fulfill these desires. We can call this the quandary of post-socialist authenticity, a condition where a radical socialist culture of collective struggle is undermined by a socialist state that has embraced the neoliberal capitalist path of economic growth. But we can equally call this post-neoliberal authenticity. For the state in question is not a typical neoliberal state, but a socialist state that does not merely become subjected to neoliberal principles and practices, but has adapted them to prolong its own survival when it has betrayed its own founding principle and no longer harmonizes with the interests of the masses that it was supposed to actualize through its institutions. Within this framework, socialist culture is no longer authentic, no longer capable of self-actualization, but a mere utopian ideal that often seems hollow. It has lost its productive aura, as Professor Larson puts it. Indeed, its core values have become thoroughly instrumentalized by Lao Tzu's deceptive behavior and also by implication by the PRC state. It is what Larson calls a residue. Happy Times, she poignantly observes, is a devastating allegory of socialism that investigates the reasons why it is impossible at the present moment of global capitalist expansion to locate the hope of a future within its ethical and experiential framework, end quote. Now, in response to this provocative lecture, I would like to make 3 comments to try to encourage further discussion amongst the audience. The first concerns the concept of authentic culture and the complex links between socialist culture and Chinese culture. Although we have now been trained to be suspicious of the concept of authenticity for promoting a static notion of culture, as an ideological mask for all kinds of nefarious political reasons, the concept, which originates from German idealist philosophy and makes its way into socialist thought via Marx, is intimately connected to freedom. Eigentlichkeit, from the eigen, refers to what is proper to oneself, what is one's own. When we act authentically or exist in a state of authenticity, we are in self-possession. We direct ourselves instead of being directed by others, and therefore we can be said to be self-originating and free. An authentic culture is a culture that expresses this principle of self-possession and enables us to grasp our freedom. Culture is here a medium, a form of self-mediation where we can recognize ourselves as free, an argument that comes from Hegel's philosophy of history. The same idea is expressed in the socialist values of communal life, collective work, and self-sacrifice. Larson's analysis of these values in Red Sorghum recalls in many ways the language of Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts. She speaks of the idealized society formed out of a joyous communal work ethic, where work and play are unified in a way that elevates daily life into a transcendent experience molded by vigor and equality. In the same way, Marx wrote that with the supersession of private property, we attain the complete emancipation of the senses, such that our activities express the fullness of human life and break down the division of labor, so that one can, and I quote, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic, end quote. This is the conceptual background to the dynamic socialist culture Red Sorghum portrays. The film's vocation is to be a form of mediation through which the Chinese masses can recognize and affirm their culture of struggle and survival. But how does what is in principle a universalistic socialist culture become uniquely Chinese, such that the folk songs in the film express this power of self-origination and become the lifeblood of the collective social body? Larson notes that the desire to determine the socialist culture as a crucial part of the Chinese experience arises when China enters the world capitalist system. In principle, this culture has a democratic content because it is part of the Chinese state's attempt to attain equality and parity, the raising up of what was weak and lower. How does this relate to the privileging of China in the idea of the proletarian nation found in early Chinese socialism, for example, that of Li Dazhang? Conversely, does not the desire for parity at the state level easily shade into the struggle to be superior in the hierarchy of the existing world system? In the latter case, universalistic socialist culture can very easily become an alibi for PRC state hegemony on the international stage. And here one cannot help but think of Zhang Yimou as the director of the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, where references to socialist culture were purged. A second comment I want to raise is that Larson ties together her analysis of both films by using the multiple logics of the gaze from film theory. On the one hand, Happy Times is an example of a critical gaze that denaturalizes an unproblematized socialist legacy and points to the impediments of contemporary China and its capitalist horizon. This is the schizoid perspective of post-socialism, where the socialist values of communal caring and helping others and common moral standards free from consumerist accumulation are registered, even as it is acknowledged that these values are bolstered by lies and tricks. On the other hand, in a way that echoes Marx on the unification of the senses, Xiao Wu's other senses are a form of return gaze that reveals the truth and points to the prospect of a non-commodified lifestyle. In fact, there may be a deeper layer to the notion of the gaze that is not primarily psychoanalytical or filmic, because the filmic gaze is here part of a more infrastructural, geopolitical, cultural vision. Zhang Yimou's intellectual agenda is governed by a certain economy of sight. To emerge as an equal on the geopolitical stage is to be visible and to be seen. But prior to being seen as an equal, there must be a foresight, a prior seeing that is a self-recognition, a recognizing of oneself so that one can critically select from past resources and traditions in order to form a socialist culture to present and stage both to oneself and for the world. What is important here is that this foresight begins with a certain Schmittian scenario of negative identification. And this is because globalization creates friend-enemy distinctions. The principle of equality is important within socialist culture, but socialist culture itself is invoked in order to assert difference at the geopolitical level. This is also found in the various instances in the films where socialist culture is constituted by reference to an outside. In Red Sorghum, authentic culture is constituted by reference to a threat from the outside, the bandit, first of all, and then the Japanese invaders. The relation to the outside leads to a negative identification that enables one to galvanize oneself in a self-understanding based on the belief in a self-originating culture. In Larson's analysis of Happy Times, there's a slightly different outside that constitutes and maintains the utopia of socialist culture. Help will come from the outside and solve the fissure between idealism and its actualization in the existing social system. But here precisely is the problem with capitalist globalization. It makes friend-enemy distinctions untenable, whether they are the distinction of territorialized political identities or partisan struggles against the class enemy, the revolutionary war of parties exemplified by Mao. This is because the reification of consciousness and biopolitical technologies have made the enemy, the outside, the desire for consumer commodities, upward mobility, etc., part of the very inside. Put another way, there is no longer any outside, and this makes the determination of any distinct and proper culture, and therefore any authentic culture, problematic. This is precisely the problem of post-socialism or post-neoliberalism. Where is the class enemy of the post-neoliberal socialist state? The Western bourgeois and capitalist is only a chimerical enemy where none can be clearly determined. Finally, the briefest comment of all. Following Marx, who himself followed Hegel, we are accustomed to thinking of history in terms of stages of progression. In responding to Professor Larson and in part drawing on her vocabulary, I have mentioned capitalist, socialist, neoliberal, post-socialist, and even post-neoliberal forms of the organization of life. Larson suggestively notes that Happy Times allows for, and I quote, a greater temporal range, end quote. The question is whether this greater temporal range also scrambles and problematizes all narrative periodization, and if so, whether this is the ground of a new form of hope that is no longer teleological. Here, the socialist legacy can indeed be regarded as a residue, but in a more affirmative sense than Larson seems to use the word. It is, I want to suggest, what Derrida calls a restance, a remainder that will always remain behind because it cannot be rendered outmoded, effaced, and destroyed by the unrelenting march of temporal progress. This remainder, however, is only problematically socialist because it problematizes these periodic determinations. Thank you. And I think Professor Larson will now take questions.
I have a question about the word residue. Could you say more about that and how it works?
Yes, there's actually a little more in the real chapter on Happy Times, and the residue as opposed to the legacy. And what I mean by the residue is something that's absolutely left over. It's absolutely left over, and I think what Professor Chia was trying to express is that it could be a kind of more of a richer term, in fact, than I actually allow it to be, because it could be gesturing towards a kind of maybe a critical approach toward these temporalizations that will turn it into something else. Now, what I see actually in Happy Times, and I don't, by the way, think it's all of Zhang Yimou's films that look at socialism. There's a limited number that do. What I think he does is to always look for some kind of a cultural base, not identifying it specifically as Chinese culture, but as something that happened in China under the specific conditions of Chinese development and Chinese society and try to see what it means for the future. So it's informed by this very temporal kind of approach. And the residue here, what I guess I probably disagree slightly with you, Peng, about the residue. I think he portrays it as something that is good, is mandatory. In other words, it will never go away. This residue will never go away because it actually is recent Chinese history. It's something very real from the history, but it's going to sit there at the bottom of the glass. It's never going to mix up.
Another answer, your gesture implies another answer to the question, which is like that it's something material, or it's something it's not in the mind, it's something sort of perceptual?
Yes. Actually, one thing I didn't have a chance to get into today was I think I mentioned a little bit, a kind of sensual authenticity that he tries to portray. And that's a very strong strand throughout the film, is that this doesn't exist as an idea. It doesn't exist in the mind. It exists as an actual life world with all of its physical forms, including language, but also including ways of being and simply sensual ways of living in the world. So yes. Mm-hmm.
Professor Larson, I wonder if you can talk about the idealization and the vitalist representation of countryside in Zhang Yimou's films and the rustic, abandoned factories. I wonder how you think about the difference, and do you see any romanticizing tendency in his representation of factory work?
Romanticization of factory work and the romanticization of the countryside? Are those your questions? Uh-huh. They're both heavily romanticized within the kind of, without trying to seem like I'm implying a certain authorial intent, with the way that Zhang Yimou's films actually do romanticize both the countryside and the factory, but they also disclose them. I mean, if you look at the early films, I think those are the ones where the countryside is heavily romanticized. Is that what you mean? In the early films, right? Red Sorghum, Chudou, Raise High the Red Lantern. As you go on, you see them increasingly less romanticized and certainly far away from anything that you could call real until you get to Choju Goes to Court. Right? When you get to Choju Goes to Court, then you have a much stronger dose of realism, but it's also constructed allegorically, as are all of his films. Now, in terms of the factory, you never see that kind of romanticization fully blown in Happy Times. Yeah, again, you see it's left over, it's residue. You do see something very powerful that was once very powerful, and that is romanticized. But that is romanticized within the instrumental question that he's asking. So it's not romanticized as something he's promoting. It's romanticized so that he can use it within the entire configuration of what he's asking about culture.
Wendy. Thank you again. It's a great talk. I just wonder, not as a non-film study person, into something very political economy stuff, I'm just wondering, I asked the same question to Penn when he was presenting Chen Guo's film a few months ago here. Being someone who's interested and profoundly analytical about Zhang Yimou's works, and which is actually very diverse. He covers very many subjects, and use sometimes these amateur, not professional actors in some of these films, and these are, romanticized ones or heavily, seemingly at least, nationalistic. So I wonder, just methodologically, how do you deal with such a diversity in terms of subjects, in terms of technique, in terms of the styles and ways of presenting it? And I also wonder, whether it matters if you have talked to him about what his intention is. Penn told me it doesn't matter. So I would like to get a second opinion.
Okay, well, those of us trained in literature or film are taught never to consider the author, filmmaker's opinion as more than that of any other person. Okay. And so we grew up under that kind of sort of approach to understanding the way an artwork works. The theory behind that is that it goes out into the world, and the filmmaker or the author cannot control it. Right? Cannot control it, and of course there's also a kind of romanticized separate sphere of art going on in here, because we allow to creative workers more leeway than we allow to other people, and so they can exist in a kind of semi-psychologized frame whereby they don't really know what they're doing. So, what you want to see is the product of their work. You don't want to actually talk to them because they won't tell you anything. So, I mean, that has to do really with the history of how we develop the notion of what an artwork really is, what a film is. So that's part of it, too. There's a historical development to that. Mm-hmm. I haven't talked to Zhang Yimou. I'm actually more worried about what Zhang Yimou, not what he would say to me, but rather that I would feel an obligation after talking to him, and I'd prefer to be completely free from that. Once I'm finished with the book and have published it, I'd love to meet him. Now, what was your first part of your question? I'm sorry.
Diversity.
Oh, the diversity. Okay, I don't. Yeah. My original idea for this project was not to work on one person, but to, like my last book, to take different, some fiction, some film, some other kinds of things, and some historical and theoretical approaches. And after I was done with that project, I became somewhat dissatisfied with that approach. I felt like it didn't have the unity that I wanted. And then there's different ways to get unity, granted. But I decided that if I could find one person, one person's work and focus on that, and in a way, it's also something that I have I dealt with in the last chapter of my last book, which is that I feel that most studies of literature and film are becoming history. They're becoming studies of history. They're becoming just really historical studies. And I wanted to move away from that and to do more kind of reading, what we would call reading in literature. I guess you can call it reading in film as well. And I felt that with that kind of a stipulation and that kind of a limit, it might be better if I could focus. I also felt like Zhang Mo really, and here again, I'm risking dangerous territory when I say it this way, but his films really do look at this question of culture over a temporal period. Not all of them do. He has some truly terrible films out there, and I don't want to become an apologist for Zhang Mo, but I think that many of them do, and I think that Hero is one of them, so that's the one that most people believe is one of his most nationalistic films.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. This is just a question for clarification. You, at one point, you show us two pictures. One is labeled as socialist style, and the other one is capitalist style. Mm-hmm. And I guess they're related to the design of the interior space. Right. And so I was wondering, I wasn't able to hear fully what you were trying to do with that distinction of the two styles. It seems to me that to use the language of style already indicates to some extent a kind of a concretization of or reconstitution of socialism within the language of aesthetics. That seems to be
I can't quite hear you. I'm sorry.
A kind of a language of aesthetics that's more naturally at home within, discussions of postmodernism, capitalism, and so forth. So, I guess my question has to do with what are you trying to do with that sort of distinction of different kinds of style, and whether the language of style itself already speaks to a certain kind of cooptation of socialism.
Okay, so it's not just the it's not just the apartments, but it's also that initial scene that I showed you, which is so carefully constructed, to have everything in it to produce this incredible kind of warm and beautiful vision. And if you just sit and analyze that scene, which goes on for a very long time, the two of them talking, you'll find that really it was so carefully put together. And I think the point maybe relates to the other question back here, which is that Zhang Yimou is not anti-socialist or pro-capitalist or the other way around. But what he wants to do, and again, please excuse my language or what he wants to do, but that's not what I really mean. But what he wants to do is to look for possibilities for something within culture that will allow for a means of going forward. And these don't have to be specifically Chinese. So what I interpret this sort of scene, which is so clearly, a contrast between the old style of decoration and the new style of decoration, is that, yes, capitalism has a style. And socialism had a style. And it is the way that she, the fiancée, who you don't get her name in the film, the way that she looks at it, and probably most people would look at it, is this is actual progress. To go from this style to that style is a kind of progress. It's more beautiful. And so there is a surface to it. As well as a very deep interior. And that surface is alluring.
Thanks. I've just been thinking about the difference between the two endings, and it was bothering me for a while. I was thinking, what is it that really bothers me about those two endings? And I think it's that what happens to the residue that you're talking about in the international ending, and what do you see as sort of the difference there?
Well, I have to confess that I haven't seen the domestic ending, so I've only read David Lee's article describing it. But from what I understand from reading his article, the films are the same, but the ending is different. So what he would say is that the residue, the residue is stronger. I mean, it's moving out of being a residue. It's starting to mix with the liquid a little bit in the domestic ending because, in fact, socialism, and I think Peng was referencing the same kind of thing. Socialism does have a still living value within Chinese culture. It's something that can still be mined for its riches, in terms of how to go forward. The beautiful, glory of capitalism is not the only thing. And so I think what he would say is that this positions the two of them, the Lao Zhao, who is hit by a truck and really can't do anything in the international vision, and Xiao Wu as compatriots in a bond that has no physical structure anymore because the factory literally falls down around them, leaving them standing by the massage table there. And so it's only that bond. So really it would be only a kind of human will, that would push forward this residue and make it into something richer and better.
Is that very unusual to have a domestic ending and an international ending?
Usually it isn't, but sometimes there is. Yeah, it's quite unusual. Mm-hmm.
I mean, how did he justify doing that? Or?
No.
Seems very strange to me.
I'm not even sure he did it. I mean, it may have been a demand from somebody else that he put a different ending on it. So I don't know. Which. Well, Keep Cool, which is the one before this, he has actually developed 6 different endings on his own, but only one of them came out. So he originally, you can read this in his interviews, he made the ending much darker than it is in the film. So possibly he did this. Maybe I'll have to keep searching for an interview where he says something about it.
It's fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. I was particularly amazed when you were challenging the notion of gays that has been long debated and criticized by introducing 2 new recent investigations. One is related to capitalism. The other is really thinking about racial other from Paulo Almer. So I wonder, just as a moment of maybe asking for clarification. Would you elaborate a little more how these three notions of gaze come together in the film?
Okay, I think the male gaze is the least relevant, to this, and obviously it's the oldest theory. But we really can't grasp upon a male gaze in this film. You can grasp that in some of Zhang Yimou's earlier films, but not in this one, I don't think. In fact, if we tried to do that, it is a kind of schizophrenic. We see two things really functioning at the same time. And Lao Zhao is so pathetic that it's hard for us to take his point of view. The other thing that makes that impossible is the reordering of the gender relations that splits So it makes the film more into a possibility of an ethical test. Are you going to rise to the ethical consideration? Because in the early films, the ethical test and the sexual self-satisfaction were linked together conveniently, and they're very separated here. Now, the second gaze is the capitalist gaze. To be honest, I have some doubts about that theory, about Todd McGowan's theory of the capitalist gaze, but I used it nonetheless in this talk because I feel that we in this very sensual and very kind of material projection of this socialist residue, there is something about it that is becomes not natural. That becomes not natural under the gaze of capitalism. And so the new visual regime of capitalism naturalizes things that and makes unnatural that kind of old socialist gaze. Now, the competition that is supposedly underlies this, and in other words, why communism failed? Communism failed because it's not based on human nature. I don't think that the film indulges in that at all. I don't think you see any kind of that sort of idea in the film. But you do see how vision can work to naturalize and normalize whatever regime you're moving toward and into. And that's the objection that I have to Todd McGowan's approach. I think actually all regimes use a visual regime to naturalize whatever it is. And then the visual repost, that in my analysis, it's really only the lack of a return gaze, that the girl is blind and so she cannot really look back and catch the eye of the other people. And yet, nonetheless, she makes a decision that enables them to continue as filmmakers. That goes even beyond what Paula Ahmed talks about. Now, in Paula Ahmed's article, I would say she beats around the bush a little tiny bit, and she says that film studies has yet to live up to what it needs to live up to actually analyze what the return gaze does. So you cannot assume that a return gaze is automatically a challenge, or that it automatically puts you in a powerful position to look back. And we see as Xiao Wu faces off with Lao Zhao in the house as they're going down like this, that she's looking at him, but she doesn't actually see him. And yet she starts to, little by little, I think this is, a part of the film where Lao Zhao starts to give up his hope that he will somehow be able to foist off the burden of Xiao Wu and get together with his fiancée, which is clearly what he believes at the beginning, that he can quickly solve the problem of this girl and then he can get married and have all of his satisfactions. So the return gaze here is more shifted onto the performer. And so what she does as a knowledgeable performer then is to give them the conditions to watch. And she does that out of kindness and empathy and out of warmth that she feels from their friendship and reaction to her. But that's completely unsustainable. So that's all.
So can I just follow up about this return gaze? So is the return gaze a matter of actually gazing at someone, or is it about putting yourself as an obstacle in the way of their gaze? Because in the scene that the scene that you screened, it's really, she's in his way. She can't see him but he can see that she's blocking his way, so to speak, right? And similarly, what's really interesting is that although she can't see, she has these heightened senses. And when you spoke about the heightening of the senses, I immediately thought about Marx, because that's what he says. Under these conditions where you are no longer alienated, your senses become unified, you become a total person, and so on. And it seems to me that it's that kind of heightening of the senses that constitutes this return gaze, so to speak, in that it makes it impossible for his gaze to position her the way he wants to position her, and so on. So it's very much like the return gaze, the way it functions is that it's like a blockage, so to speak, rather than a way of her seeing him. It's a matter of him seeing her in a way that doesn't correspond to the way he might intentionally want to see her, so to speak.
Oh, I think that's a very good point. I mean, that actual sequence is one that pushes him more toward taking responsibility for her. So yes, that's a very good point, I think. And it's kind of funny because actually in the chapter I call these superpowers her superpowers, which she really does have. You know, she has all of these different superpowers that I didn't all address in my talk. But I think that the return gaze is more relevant when she understands that she's being tricked. Because at that point, she changes what the return gaze is supposed to do is to change the nature of the filmmaker, right? The filmer, the one who's looking, the person who is filming the colonized. So it's supposed to change that person and give that person a jolt to let that person know that there is awareness. And yet what she does is in fact the opposite. She learns that they are tricking her, but she allows it to go on, right? But that really is a kind of agency. That she shows throughout a little by little development toward that kind of agency.
Mm-hmm. Therefore, the agency does not have to be expressed through visual. So it's not the gaze, the return gaze. It's not a visual method. It can be returned through other values or methods, right? Because then once she understands what's going on, and then she still exercises her, power or influence through other means, rather than gaze directly back at those who are looking at her.
Well, she doesn't have the ability to gaze directly back, right?
And that makes it more interesting because without her visual ability, she still manages her agency in that sense.
Having her blind, of course, enhances the ethical confrontation and, the formation of the problematic as being an ethical one. It's an ethical problem to some degree, but not all, not 100%. Mm-hmm.
I mean, if she weren't blind, there would be no way that the pretense could continue.
That's right.
Right. So, I mean, because she's blind, it gives it that extra layer where she can be said to be, even generous in, because she could have called his bluff and so on, but she decided not to.
Yes, correct. Yes.
You mentioned your desire not to put these in a historical context, and of course, as a historian, I want to try and push back on that a little bit. And I guess my question is, obviously, China changes enormously between the time of Red Sorghum and Happy Times, and you seem to be asserting to some degree that Zhang Yimou is maintaining certain values over that time. And I guess my question is Zhang Yimou, are you trying to say Zhang Yimou is consistent as China is changing all the way from 87 to 2000, or how is Zhang Yimou changing over that as China is changing?
By the way, this is the professor of Chinese history who encouraged me to go to graduate school when he was at the University of Oregon. So I think I'm in a no-win situation here. I don't think Zhang Yimou is consistent, and I actually don't think he is maintaining certain values. And I often use the word investigation. His films are a kind of investigation, but I don't mean that like a person goes out and tries to figure out. But I would say he tends to find topics, and he tends to alter novels and short stories in a way that not all of his films, but many of them, will function as this kind of cultural query directed at the past, the future, the present. So it's a kind of, he's looking for a kind of what kind of cultural aspects of culture are there? And he doesn't mean by this dragons and, red clothes and that kind of thing. He doesn't mean that. But he means more substantial bases on which to somehow collectively recognize past experience and not dismiss it and just go on to something else, but to recognize it, to somehow grasp it, and can it be grasped and can it be transformed into a future direction? I think that's what it is. So it's not exactly values, but does that answer your question?
Yeah, to a degree. Obviously, we get into enormous implications. I immediately think, well, isn't in his Olympics program trying to convey to us a sense of Chinese culture that he seems as relevant to the present and future? Isn't he trying to do something, consistent there in the residues of the past and to systematize it in some way?
The Olympics are very interesting, and the opening and the closing performances that almost always try to capture some, usually rather simplistic notion of culture, and it's not just China, but everything is like this. They are organized on the nation-state model, right? They come out of that period. They are organized in that way. I think my impression is that by the time basically he got to Hero or slightly after, this kind of investigation into foundational sort of cultural things that are not, calligraphy, not that kind of culture, but we could call it a more spiritual culture, was basically over. And I think he just grabbed easy things for the Olympics and put them out there. He did it in a very spectacular way, however. So that's actually, I'm going to deal with the Olympics in my conclusion, because it's very hard to have maybe he's kind of like the, what's his name, Modiani, the new Modiano, the Nobel Prize literature person who keeps revisiting the same problem over and over and over. I just read today that the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to this French writer, and he keeps going back to life under the Nazis. And in a way, I think, Zhang Yimou keeps going back, looking at different aspects of how culture can provide something sort of life-giving and positive. But eventually, this query stops, and I don't think that he's doing it in the Olympics. Yeah. And there are several other really bad films, too.
Tell us which one, so we will.
No. You decide for yourself.
So, any more questions, or we should all thank Professor Wendy Larson and Penn also for this wonderful presentation and discussion. And thank you all for coming.